Social meditation practice can be defined quite simply as any form of practice that's done with others. So here we kind of have a spectrum in social practice. On the one side is the most social you could imagine, being extremely interactive with other people, all of your senses engaged in relationship with others. And in the other side is the totally solo experience of just meditating by yourself. And then there's a whole spectrum between those two extremes. So let me give a couple examples here. As I said, you could be meditating totally by yourself, or you could imagine the most engaged, relational, sensorily integrated experience possible that's meditative. I don't know what that is. I haven't done that practice yet, but I imagine it's something like being in relationship with your family and bringing a meditative attitude to that. And then there's stuff in between. There are practices that have been done as social practices for a long time. Things like eye gazing, for instance, where you're making visual contact with another person and looking into each other's eyes. There's quite a lot of social connection there, but there isn't any verbalization. There's no concepts. There's no out loud talking. So you could say it's somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Some of the practices that we do with people include things like social noting, where you're doing an out loud mindfulness practice and saying out loud what's arising moment to moment with other people. So there's a verbal component, but oftentimes people aren't necessarily staring at each other. And so it's too kind of in the middle of the range. So if we've got a spectrum here from the totally individual to the totally immersive social experience. And social meditation is any practice that's done with other people. So even if you're sitting quietly with a group of people, that would be considered social practice in one way. But it's like the most solo type of social practice I could imagine. And what I've noticed is that most modern meditation circles, and I say most because there are many exceptions to this, but for the most part, modern meditation has skewed heavily toward the solo end of the spectrum. And I think the reason for that is that we have, in the last few hundred years, really been growing into and maturing into a worldview that's based on individualism, that came out of the Western Enlightenment, and that really put the individual at the center of everything, culturally, politically, in religious terms. And modern meditation techniques have been very influenced by that individual, rational worldview. But what's happening now in the digital age, with the internet in particular, is that our worldview is going through a dramatic transformation, a dramatic change. And we're moving from understanding ourselves primarily as all these separate individuals to understanding ourselves as part of the network, as part of this interconnected network that spans the globe. The networked identity is not about individualism. It's a recognition that the network makes us up as much as we make it up, perhaps even more so. We understand ourselves in terms of the communities, the subgroups, the subcultures, the subreddits that we're part of. We move through these different tribes, these different cultures online, and we become different people as we do so. Our identity and our personalities are becoming much more fluid, much less fixed, much less focused on I and much more focused on we. So social meditation techniques are in a sense a digital age upgrade to modern meditation. I was first introduced to social practice about 5 years ago from one of my own teachers, Kenneth Folk. And Kenneth, just like myself, had been really trained in a particular technique called noting meditation. This is a Burmese Buddhist practice that's very powerful, and it's done in silence, and it's done using internal verbal notes to describe your experience, as I mentioned before. I had done this practice for several years at this point and done thousands of hours of practice in silent retreat and at home by myself. But I'd never done it with other people. And what Kenneth shared with me is that as he was starting to work with new students, he was finding that it was quite helpful to actually teach them the noting practice out loud. And what he was finding is that when he did it out loud with people, he could hear how the other person was practicing, and he could also model how he was practicing. And so this was, in a sense, an innovation in terms of teaching the technique at first. But then what he found as he did it more and more is that the implications of doing it out loud actually made the practice quite different. He termed this initial practice ping pong noting, because you're going back and forth, back and forth. It's, in a sense, a two-player form of meditation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the implications of it, but what I'll say there is that I started to also work with students in this way to teach them and train them using the out loud noting technique. And what I found over time is that people learned how to do the technique quicker. I could give better feedback more rapidly. They could hear how I was practicing out loud, so it made meditation not this kind of mysterious thing that we're doing with our eyes shut, but it became something that actually could be verbalized and experienced and expressed between two people. So this was a huge leap for me, learning this technique and actually starting to practice it myself more and work with students with it. I started to see, wow, something is going on with this social practice that's unique and different from the solo practice. From there, after a few years, Emily and I, as we worked with students, started to realize and started to do this technique more with more people in larger groups. And as we learned more from Kenneth as he did it, that there's a basic principle involved in making meditation techniques social. And that is that you take the techniques that have already a verbal component, some sort of internal verbalization, they include the mind in some way, and that you can then take that technique and do it out loud in some way with other people together. So from here we started to quickly play with techniques like social inquiry, where you're working with questions out loud in different configurations, 2 or 3 or 4 people at a time, even large groups of 10 or more. And we also started experimenting with a practice that we call social breath counting, taking the very old technique of counting the breath as you sense into it, and using that counting as a way to stay focused on the breath, to do that out loud with other people. And what this does in all of these cases is it extends the meditative practice into the social field. It makes meditation social. Let me talk about what I've seen are the unique advantages and benefits of that social practice. And I want to preface that by saying that there are also downsides or things that you lose when you do a social practice compared to doing it by yourself. I'm not going to talk so much about that because I feel like the advantages and the benefits of solo practice have been really elucidated quite clearly. Perhaps at some point we could get into the downsides of social practice, but for now, I want to talk about some of the unique benefits. So the first benefit, and often the most obvious when someone first tries social practice, is that these social techniques use and utilize social pressure, peer pressure, to maximize the continuity of your focus and attention. So let me give an example here. When you're doing the social breath counting practice, for instance, and you're counting out loud from 1 to 10 with other people, your breath, there is a way in which you know that when it's your turn to count, you really have to count. You really have to stay with your breath and do it, because not only are you accountable to the count itself, but you are accountable to all these other people. And we are so deeply social creatures. We care so much what other people think and feel about us. And that's just true. Our rational mind may think that that's not true or think that it shouldn't be the case. But time after time after time, I've just seen that this is true for human beings. It's how we've evolved and it's how we are. So the social practice, in a sense, hijacks that social reality, which in many cases feels uncomfortable and like a bad thing. And it uses it in service of developing a more continuous focus, where because we don't want to lose the breath and not be able to count out loud, because we don't want to let people down, we stay much more focused on the object, whatever that object of meditation is. So that's one of the first benefits. Another one is that this social practice very quickly reveals and helps us start to untangle our social conditioning through social awareness. So when I say social conditioning, I mean things like social anxiety, for instance. One of the challenging parts of doing social practice is it very quickly, for many people, can bring up social anxiety. Just like speaking in front of a group or going into a new situation where you're with new people. For many people, and for some people it's quite debilitating, we can feel a lot of anxiety about that social interaction, the uncertainty of what it's going to be like, how people are going to perceive me. Will I make a mess of the situation? Am I going to look like an idiot? All of those things are very strongly conditioned in us as human beings. And so going into this practice and bringing awareness, actually doing a practice of awareness, helps very quickly reveal, almost in a hyper-focused way, that social conditioning. And usually the first response when someone has done solo meditation a lot and comes into a social practice situation is they go, oh, I felt really anxious and I felt really distracted by all the other people, and it didn't feel as deep and as profound as when I normally practice. And I say to them, well, yeah, that's because we're doing a social practice and it's bringing up social conditioning. It's highlighting how the mind and body and emotions function in social situations. And so it's actually, in a sense, inviting our conditioning that doesn't actually get triggered as much when we're by ourselves. We can't actually see that social conditioning when we're practicing in a situation that isn't social. So that's one of the benefits of social practice also. Another form of kind of social conditioning I think is quite common is the tendency we have to position ourselves socially, either above other people, that we're better than them, or beneath them, like I'm so much worse than this other person, I'm doing it in such a poor way compared to them, I'm so awful. And even social conditioning, social positioning can be like, I'm equal to this person, I'm the same, I'm as good as them. And so that social positioning is something that we're always doing, and even when we're sitting by ourselves, we have thoughts about being better than someone or less than someone. But when we're in a group doing social practice, it's so much more clear, that conditioning. And so by bringing awareness to it, and this is a basic principle of meditation, whether it's solo or social, we start to first see the pattern more clearly, to see how it operates, how it functions in our experience. And the seeing helps us start to untangle it. But the seeing isn't enough. And this is another benefit of social practice, is that not only do we see our social conditioning, but we actually start to increase through practice a sense of interpersonal connection, of feeling connected with other people, as well as being able to empathize more clearly with these others, these other people. We start to feel more connected and more empathic. We start to feel more of what other people are feeling. When we bring wisdom to that empathy, when we bring clear seeing to that empathy, it leads to, in my experience, more compassion. Because empathy by itself is really just the capacity to feel what others are feeling. Now, many sociopaths have actually developed quite a bit of empathy. They know what other people are feeling and can use that to manipulate them. This is known in the psychological research. So empathy by itself does not equate to compassion. We actually have to not just feel what other people are feeling, but start to understand the causes of that feeling, to feel for their feeling, to want to alleviate their suffering, and to, in a sense, tap into some deeper part of ourselves, which can hold the suffering of others and hold the suffering of ourselves, to hold the suffering of the network. So as we deepen into social practice, if we're bringing that kind of discernment and wisdom to this increased connection, increased empathy, then we can also see a greater degree of compassion start to flow into our relationships. And this practice of social meditation, no matter what kind of technique one is doing, it translates off of the cushion, out of the formal practice environment, into the rest of our relationships. In the same way that when we exercise and work out, the strength, the conditioning, the aerobic capacity that we've developed there translates into the rest of our life. So too does social practice translate into how we're in relationship with each other. We're able to bring greater clarity, greater awareness, greater focus, greater open-heartedness into our relationships with each other. And this opens up all kinds of possibilities that while solo meditation can also help with, it's a little bit more indirect in my experience than the social practice. Solo meditation doesn't always prepare us for being able to be sitting across from another person, to be feeling the reverberations of their words through our body, and to be tracking the different feelings and thoughts and awarenesses that are happening in very rapid succession between us. Because usually we're focused on our experience, but we have to also train to be focused on the other's experience. Because the other and I, in this networked age, we are not separate. We're interconnected in a way that can't be very easily disconnected. And the result of this, the new reality that we're living in, is that we have to make our contemplative training, our mind training, a social training as well.